welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm Barbara Meyers. We're very pleased and honored to have as our guest today the Reverend Byron Williams. Reverend Williams is the only pastor / syndicated columnist in the country. And he's the pastor of the Resurrection Community Church in Oakland, and he writes a twice weekly social political column for the Oakland Tribune that appears in 10 publications and several progressive websites throughout the country. Byron is also a mental health consumer and has written about mental health in his column. This is the reason why he's with us today. Byron has spoken throughout the country and has appeared on numerous television and radio programs, including CNN, ABC Radio, Fox News, and NPR. He's also a featured writer on the Huffington Post. We're most honored to have him as our guest. Welcome, Byron.
Thank you.
What I'd like to do is talk to you about your story. And as I see it, your story is how you've been able to make a meaningful life, or how you've been led into meaning in your life. And so I'd like to start by the story of how you grew up and how you became a minister and that kind of things.
Well, actually, I'm a local kid. I grew up in Berkeley,
Mm-hmm.
and then I went away to the University of Nebraska on a basketball scholarship, and then Idaho State, and that's where I graduated from. And then I lived in Washington D.C. for a little while, and I came back to the Bay Area in the early '80s, and started Pacific Stock Exchange as a floor broker. And then sort of moved from there. I left with the market crash in the late '80s, and that's how I sort of gotten into working for various political elected officials. And I did some lobbying for a couple of organizations, and there was, I always wanted to write. It was giving me the writing side first, and I always wanted to write. And then I was led to the seminary, but I never wanted to pastor. That was not. I became really fascinated with sort of the questions that theology raised, and that's what led me to seminary. And it was never with the intention of pastoring, just to write. And so as I went along in my seminary career, I was more and more passionate about writing, and I thought that it was quite possible that there could be this theological voice in sort of a daily publication, sort of in the same way that Reinhold Niebuhr did it in the 50s and 60s, where you don't necessarily have to name it, but you could write about redemption, you could write about justice, you could write about hope, but you never have to really say the sort of biblically tainted words in the public square. So I mean that's sort of a I don't know how you'd say it, interesting way of how I got here. But the way I actually started pastoring was I had all these critiques. And I had these critiques about the church, and pastoring almost started as a dare. I had a really close friend that said, if you feel that way about the church, then you should pastor. Prior to that, I never thought about pastoring, and I've been at the Resurrection Community Church since 2002.
So did you start the church?
I did, yes, I did.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I did start it. And just based on some of those principles that I believe very strongly, like when you said when you were there. I mean, we always talk about the importance of how people feel in the worship experience, and if someone is new, I mean that could be a very vulnerable moment, and you don't know why people came, and if they don't feel love coming from the church, they have absolutely no reason to come back. And so those are some of the things that we talk. I put them in my sermons and in Bible study and so forth. Well,
as you know, I visited your church, and they live it out. You know, they really act out that welcoming to the stranger.
Makes me very happy.
And it was genuine too. I mean, you could tell it came from what they believe and what they feel needs to be done. What is it that happened that made you change from a career of being in the stock market? Was it just a crash, or was it something else that helped you change your direction in your career?
Well, one thing I knew, even while I was a stockbroker, and then even went on from there to be a lobbyist, the one thing I knew was I enjoyed writing.
Mm-hmm.
I would write letters to the editor, and I did the occasional, op-ed,
Mm-hmm.
Contributor piece, and I always got such joy out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain people, I just always thought being a columnist was just like the greatest profession you could possibly have. I have felt that for a long time. In fact, and as an undergrad, I religiously read Dad Hintoff's column,
Mm-hmm.
he was a columnist with the Village Voice up until about 2 weeks ago. He's 83, and so I just thought being a columnist was the greatest thing in the world. I also sort of had this question throughout my seminary time: why isn't there a theological voice? Now, and I don't mean the religiosity that we get by a lot of so-called mainstream or mega church leaders. I don't mean that.
Mm-hmm.
But why isn't there a theological voice part of the public conversation? Mm-hmm. And so it's just those two things that sort of forced me to this. Plus, it was just a passion. It started with being a real passion of mine.
Isn't it said that when you follow your passion, you follow your bliss? That's when your life becomes meaningful and what you want it to be. I'd like for you to tell us about your experience with the mental health system, whether it was public or private, and sort of how that came about.
I was going through some very challenging times in my life. Just a custody battle, with my son.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually went for, I was going for, I used, up until I hurt my knee, I was an avid jogger, I jogged all the time. I was going for a run, and I had what was later diagnosed as an anxiety attack while I was running.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I was dying.
Yeah.
I thought that, that was it.
It feels like with a heart attack. That's how they.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I got checked out, and I was fine.
Mm-hmm.
And there was nothing. Everything checked out. I was in great shape. And then the doctor said, "Well, what are you doing?" He started asking me just little basic things about my life. He says, "You could be depressed." Just sort of. I'm like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
And I was diagnosed, major depressive disorder, and that's what first got me there. And because I'm a single parent, and my son was very young then, when it first happened, it really, I want to learn as much about this as I can.
Mm-hmm.
And because I had an obligation not only to him, not only to me, but I had an obligation to him. And I didn't want to get to a point to where this thing was controlling me. Mm-hmm. How could I be as in control or as proactive? Let me say it that way. How could I be as proactive about it as possible? And then that's when I started finding out what I could do, what worked for me, and so I took literally a crash course in major depressive disorder.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of things did you find that worked for you?
Well, the first thing, let me start with what didn't work.
Oh, okay.
The first thing I found out didn't work was medication for me.
Mm-hmm.
As a writer, it just cut off the creative flow for me. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, I had to come up with all these other things.
Yeah, that were going to give you the benefits that might have come from medication.
And some of them will sound very, very overly simplistic, something mundane, but they're critical for me. Mm-hmm. For example, it is critical every morning when I get up that I make the bed. Mm-hmm. That is critical. Because an unmade bed for me is like calling to me. Yeah. It's like saying, I'll forget all that, Byron. Just come back and pull the covers up and don't do anything. Yeah. So making a bed becomes critical. Working out becomes, critical. Mm-hmm. If I work at home, which is good and bad. Mm-hmm. The bad part of it is when you start to feel that little anxiety, making sure I'm getting out, go for a walk, still be very conscious about being social with people. There's a lot of little things, but if I've noticed, if I start to slip on any of them, I start to slowly, slip back to that place. That's not a good place for me.
That's very much in concert with some of the latest thinking of people being able to understand what triggers them and what helps them, and to keep a record for themselves, and then also to be able to say, well, if the things really get bad, here's what I want to have done, and here's what I don't want to have done, so that's really good that you have discovered that. It's really right in line with what
I would also say that here's the other thing, that behavior has bled over to other areas of my life. For example, as we were talking before, I'm very, very regimented about my day, and I'm very, and that's how I'm very productive with writing sermons and writing columns and working on a book. But that started with just these. What are these things I need to do, for my mental health, to make sure that I don't slip back? And so these things that we talk about have bled over to other areas of my life.
So you weren't hospitalized or with
No.
other patients or group therapy or anything like that?
No.
This was sort of between you and your doctor?
Yeah, right, between my, yeah.
I know your column is widely read in newspapers, and I'm wondering if you can give examples of some of the changes that have affected the lives of other people, especially with regard to mental health.
Funny you would ask me that.
Yeah.
I normally write a social political column. That's the basis of my column.
Right.
However, sometimes you take a break, and so one week, I decided I'm going to write a piece on depression. On a widely read column, you'll get, if it's widely read, I'll get 50 emails. I did a piece on depression. I got over 600 emails.
Wow, 600.
And there was a stretch where people were literally stopping me on the street and thanking me, for writing it. And people would start. I got emails where people would start by thanking me. Then they'd say, they would say things like, "Please don't publish this because no one in my family knows." And it really opened my eyes. And now I had the things that we talked about that I hadn't been doing for a few years, but it really opened my eyes to just how many people are still walking around in silence. Not just people walking around in silence to where their own family members, their own spouse, they have no idea. And they've been diagnosed and haven't told anyone. And don't feel that that's a place. And one of the things I found, if I can just add this one thing, one of the things I found in some of those exchanges was part of the problem is that it did not feel safe. You're depressed, and so there's someone feeling, well, what can I do to cheer you up? It's just not understanding the full ramification of what that means, or just snap out of it. Come on, get up, and you're okay. And so they didn't feel safe, and so you have a lot. I just realized based on the email exchanges that I received, you have a large number of people in our society that have been diagnosed. There's a lot of people who have been diagnosed. That's another category, but they've been diagnosed but do not feel safe. And I can't think of anything that's more critical, than being in an atmosphere where you feel safe. I can't.
And I think it's when somebody, some respected figure like you, stands up and say, "I am too." Suddenly that makes it safe, for people, at least to even talk with you. And I know I don't remember if I shared this with you before, but when I talk in congregations, a lot of times I tell my own story about my own struggle with mental health and how the church was very helpful. And after I talk about it for some time, at the end I ask for a public witness of people to stand if they or someone they love is living with a mental illness. And every time I've done it, somewhere between 80 and 100% of the people
Wow.
will stand up. And all of them are looking around. They can't believe that it's affected so many people. And then in coffee hour afterwards, they're all abuzz about, well, my daughter this, or I have this, and did you know I had that, and suddenly it's okay to talk about it. It's just somebody coming up and standing up like you did, and saying publicly, that does a tremendous amount of good. It's the biggest stigma buster that I've been able to discover. So I mean, that's great. Have there things that you have found as a minister that were a church is not particularly helpful to people?
Well, each church is different, and I think that a church is as helpful or as harmful has a lot to do with its fundamental theological beliefs. Mm-hmm. Whatever those are, that will determine how harmful or how helpful a church is in this area. I mean, for example, and not to paint broad strokes, but it's been my experience, those who tend to have a more fundamentalist approach to theology, especially if it bleeds over into trying to give an answer for a condition, that can be very harmful. I remember I was flipping channels one day, and happened to see a pastor, and he was talking about that's not you're not depressed. That's a demon. That's a demonic spirit, and I'm just and I was just shocked. I'm like, do you know the damage? That you're doing? And I don't think that most of these people are trying to do something malicious. I'm not suggesting that they're trying to do anything malicious, but I am saying it is out of an ignorance, out of the unknown, that they are doing damage. And so then you have people feeling that they can't tell their story, that it's not safe, and ultimately they'll move away from the church.
Yeah. So what are some things where you found that the church can be particularly helpful?
Well, when the church is helpful, I think, when it starts with taking people as they are, and again, you've been to my church once, and how everyone greets you, but it starts with little things, being a community. Barbara, I haven't seen you for a couple of weeks. How are you feeling? I mean, all those little gestures of kindness and warmth create safety. Safety doesn't happen in one day. It's like you're there one day and then you feel safe and then you tell your story. But it happens over time. And those who are there, that you have to be vulnerable. I think that my role as a columnist and as a pastor obligates me to some degree, to be vulnerable. I mean, we've seen so many times where individuals, we've seen it with pastors, unfortunately, where pastors that have made homosexuality and same-sex marriage their agenda, their mission, when it turns out that they're not really comfortable saying that this is actually who I am as well. And I think that there's nothing more tragic than that, when you feel that you cannot live, that's not safe. And so that's when really some really bad behavior sprouts, when people aren't safe. And so we want people, and I really urge that with the congregation, we want people to tell a story, and I have to start with me. If I'm vulnerable, if I'm telling my story, I think that'll create a safe atmosphere for individuals to do likewise.
Yeah, I know for me, when I started going to a church after major psychiatric episode, just being, they say in the Unitarian Church, each person is an inherent worth and dignity, and just I was really treated like that. And as you say, over the weeks, I felt like I was embraced by those people and cared about by those people, even though a lot of them didn't know what my history was. You know, it helped me tremendously to have community like that.
Some of the things I got from people who knew me when I wrote the first column about depression, some people who knew me said to me, well, you seem normal.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that if the church can make it safe, we can debunk that. That if you're depressed, you're not normal. See, you seem normal, i.e., but you're not normal. And it's this kind of that thing. And so that we can do away with that kind of language and see, you know, that there's no place for that. It's not helpful.
Yeah.
I'm normal as I'm going to get. So.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you something about the African American community.
Sure.
Do you feel that, in your experience, that there's a greater deal of stigma in the African American community about mental health in society at large, or if you have a way of gauging that?
Well, I gauge it from my own family experience. There was I grew up in a household and an extended family that held the belief that African Americans didn't commit suicide. So that was sort of that was the the belief sort of out there. So as a result, you had stories like, well, Uncle Willie was just cleaning the gun, it just went off. Or Sam was walking along the bridge, he slipped on ice, fell into the river and drowned. And so there was always these extenuating circumstances for these accidents, and as I got older, I was like, wait a minute. You know, maybe Uncle Willie wasn't cleaning the gun. Maybe Uncle Willie was depressed. And so that's the first part. Now I think the other thing that carries over, again, talking about other aspects bleeding in other areas, that carries over into the church. And so you have a lot of people within the historical African American church that don't feel safe to talk about their mental health challenges, and I gauged that by a number of people who sent me emails after I wrote that piece on depression. My church doesn't know. Please, don't tell anyone. And feeling that they couldn't tell their church.
Well, you mentioned that you're a father, and I wanted you to tell about the importance of fatherhood in your life.
We've talked about the column and columnist and being a pastor, but there's nothing more important than my being a father. My son is 13 years old. He's a great kid. He doesn't always think I think that sometimes because in the yin and the yang, but he's a great kid. I'm very, very proud of him. He's very, very intelligent. And when he was young, and I want to take this back, just to my own mental health issues. It was important for me because of him. He was so small that I had to be proactive about this because I didn't want it to impact him and negatively impact him. And so that was one of the reasons. And to be honest, if I didn't have him, I don't know if I would have been as proactive. It's quite possible I wouldn't have been as proactive. But he was a reason that I wanted to be as proactive about this and learn as much about it and about myself. I mean, at the end of the day, my condition was really about giving greater insight to me. It wasn't about what anyone else thought. It was gaining greater insight to me. What are my triggers? What works for me? What's a good place for me? What's a bad, what's a bad place for me?
I'm going to move on and give a challenge to those of you in the studio audience who are watching out there. Do you know someone who has a mental health problem but is reluctant to tell anyone? Maybe it's a friend of yours, maybe it's you. And if so, can you think of what you might be able to do to help them understand that it's possible that they can get help and recover from their illness, and that their life can be enriched beyond all their expectations if they do? So That's your assignment. I'd like to mention a couple of resources. One is Byron Williams' website called www.byronspeaks.com, and it contains a lot of information about Byron and has links to all of his columns and his blogs and his books that he's written and his itinerary day by day where he's going to be for months on end, and very interesting and very enriching. And also, I've been told that if you want to know about whether he's written about a particular topic, if you just Google Byron Speaks and the name of the topic, you can find out whether he's written about it.
That's true.
It's all over the internet. And the other resource that I wanted to mention is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, www.nami.org, which is sort of the premier mental health organization in the country, and it has lots of local affiliates and lots of groups for families as well as for people who are consumers. I'd like to thank you, Byron, very much for your gracious presence here with us today. And I'd like to end by telling the viewers, take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there's another truth. You are not alone. Thank you. I'll see you next time.